Don't go near him. He attacks. The warning came from a decorated Navy SEAL. Bishop, his Belgian Malinois, was snarling at the end of a leash, while 3 staff members backed against the wall. Then the small-town vet knelt down. No commands, no restraints, just an open hand. Bishop walked past his handler and pressed his head into her palm. What Jace Whitaker didn't know was that Dr. Eliza Merritt had saved this dog once before. The records had been erased, the mission buried. But Bishop remembered. The dog hadn't chosen a stranger over his seal. He had chosen the one person the system had tried hardest to make him forget. And that recognition was about to unbury everything someone powerful needed to stay hidden. If this kind of story is what you come here for, the ones about loyalty, about what gets buried and what refuses to stay that way, subscribe. There's more where this came from. The Canyon Ridge Animal Emergency Center did not look like a place where anything important happened. It sat at the edge of Redstone Bend, Montana, between a closed-down hardware store and a gas station that still advertised fuel prices from 3 winters ago. The waiting room held 6 plastic chairs, a dying fern, and a handwritten sign reminding clients that payment was due at time of service. On most nights. The most serious case Eliza Merritt handled was a retriever that had eaten something it shouldn't have. She had chosen this on purpose. Eliza was 32 years old and had the kind of stillness about her that people mistook for coldness. She didn't explain herself more than necessary, didn't make small talk with the staff between cases, and kept her personal history. They were half right. What they didn't know was that she had spent 4 years before Redstone Bend working inside a naval veterinary rehabilitation program, treating canines that came back from classified deployments with injuries that didn't appear in any official report. She had been good at that work. She had been, in fact, the one who started asking why the injuries didn't appear in the reports. That question had cost her everything, her position, her security clearance, and any illusion she had carried about the system she'd believed in. Redstone Bend was not a fresh start. It was a place to stop bleeding. She was reviewing post-op notes at the front desk when the doors blew open at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The man came in first, tall, broad through the shoulders, moving the way people move when they've spent years operating in tight spaces and haven't entirely unlearned it. He was somewhere in his late 30s, jaw set, eyes doing a rapid sweep of the room that had nothing to do with looking for a receptionist. Behind him, on a heavy-duty leash that was already fraying at one end, came the dog. The Belgian Malinois was enormous. His coat was dark fawn and black, his chest deep, his muscles visibly coiled, even through the thick tactical harness he wore. He came through the door already snarling, low and continuous, the sound of something that had moved past warning and into a different register entirely. 2 staff members who had been restocking supply shelves near the entrance took 3 large steps backward. A third, carrying a tray of instruments, set it down on the nearest counter with a clatter and didn't pick it up again. "I need a vet," the man said. His voice was controlled, the kind of controlled that takes years to build. "He's been deteriorating for 2 days. He won't let anyone near him." Eliza came around the desk. She took in the dog the way she took in every animal, not starting with the behavior, but with the body underneath it. The Malinois was pulling against the leash and feet from the dog and did not move closer. "How long has he been reacting this way to people?" "About 10 months. Started gradual, got worse. 3 clinics before this said it was behavioral PTSD from deployment. 1 recommended euthanasia." The man said the last word the way someone says something they've been trying not to think about, flatly, with the affect stripped out. "His name is Bishop. I'm Jace Whitaker. I was his handler." Eliza's attention was still on the dog. Bishop had not stopped snarling, but she had already noticed something the other clinics apparently hadn't looked for. His aggression was not tracking her the way a dog with genuine predatory or fear-based reactivity would track a target. He wasn't watching her face. He wasn't watching her hands. He was holding his weight slightly off his right rear quarter, compensating with his left shoulder in a way that raised the entire left side of his frame by half an inch. When he shifted to keep her in his sightline, his back end moved a fraction of a second late. She crouched down. Not all the way, just enough to take herself out of the standing posture that read as authority. She dropped her gaze slightly to the left of Bishop's eyes. She kept her hands still at her sides. Jace made a short, sharp sound. "Lady, what I just said, I know what you said." She didn't raise her voice. "Give me 90 seconds. He didn't give them willingly. He gave them because Bishop at that moment did something Jace had apparently not seen him do in a very long time. The snarling dropped. Not all at once. It unwound, slowly, like a frequency being dialed down. Bishop's weight shifted. He took one step forward, then another. Then he walked past Jace Whitaker. Past the man who had handled him through 3 overseas deployments. Past the man whose voice he had been trained to respond to above all others. And pressed his broad, heavy head into Eliza's open hands. The room was completely quiet. Jace stood with the fraying leash still in both fists, staring at his dog with an expression that moved through several things before settling into something unreadable. Eliza stayed exactly where she was, both palms resting lightly against the sides of Bishop's skull, and read the body from 3 inches away. Up close, what she'd seen from across the room was confirmed, and worse. The right hip was sitting low. The muscle mass on the right rear leg was visibly reduced compared to the left, the kind of asymmetry that developed over months of compensatory movement, not weeks. His breathing was slightly elevated for a dog who had just stopped snarling and was now standing still. She looked up at Jace. "When did he last have imaging done?" she asked. Jace's jaw moved. The program cleared him before discharge. Full physical signed off. Said he was fit. "What program?" "A beat. Naval Canine. He served with my unit." Eliza stood slowly, keeping one hand on Bishop's neck as she straightened. "I want to run X-rays and a CT. Tonight." She looked at Jace directly for the first time. "The behavior you're describing, the aggression, the reactivity, the deterioration over 10 months, that's not what a psychological trauma response looks like in isolation. He's been guarding a physical injury. Everything else is downstream of that." Jace looked at his dog, then back at her. The expression on his face was complicated in the way that expressions get when someone has been living with one explanation for a long time and is not ready to replace it. 3 vets looked at him, board certified, specialty practices. They all said, "I know what they said." Eliza kept her voice even. "I'd like to know what the imaging says. You can stay with him through the whole process." It was not the offer that moved him. It was Bishop who had not lifted his head from somewhere near Eliza's hip and showed no inclination to do so. Jace Whitaker looked at that for a long moment, then nodded once. The CT results came back at 1:15 in the morning, and Eliza stood in front of the display screen for almost a full minute before she moved. There was a hairline fracture in the right ilium, an old one, healed wrong, laying down bone in a pattern that indicated it had gone untreated for months. Significant ligament damage at the right hip joint, and in the soft tissue, just medial to the sciatic notch, a foreign object, metal, small, dense, sitting in close proximity to the nerve bundle, like something that had migrated there over time and decided to stay. The bone remodeling alone put the original trauma at a minimum of 10 months prior, probably longer. She pulled up Bishop's discharge paperwork on her tablet. The official Naval Canine Health Certification listed no orthopedic abnormalities, no soft tissue injuries, and was signed off on full operational fitness. She read it twice, then a third time, because she was looking for something she hoped she wouldn't find. The certifying signature at the bottom matched a name she recognized from a retirement announcement she had seen years before, a naval veterinary officer who had retired 14 months prior to the date on this form. She set the tablet down on the counter very carefully and stood in the dark room with the imaging still lit up on the screen behind her. She knew this shape of thing. The substituted photograph, the backdated certification, the clean record on a dog that had been nowhere near clean. She had seen it before, in a different program, in a different state, before she had made the mistake of writing it all down and sending it up a chain of command that had no interest in receiving it. That had been the end of her career in naval veterinary work. That had been the reason she was standing in a small emergency clinic in Montana, instead of anywhere she had originally planned to be. She reached for her notebook, not the digital intake form. The paper one she kept in the left pocket of her coat. The one whose cover had worn soft at the corners from years of handling. She opened it to a blank page and started writing down everything she'd seen, exactly as she'd seen it, in the order she'd seen it. When she walked back out to the waiting room, Jace was standing at the window with his arms crossed, looking at the dark street outside with the focused blankness of a man actively not thinking about something. He turned when he heard her. She set the printed imaging results on the counter between them. "There's a fracture in his right hip that healed incorrectly," she said. "Ligament damage at the same joint. And there is a metal fragment sitting against the sciatic nerve that needs to come out surgically, or the neurological deterioration will continue. This injury is at minimum 10 months old. It was present at the time of his discharge physical." Jace looked at the imaging for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter than the controlled register he'd come in with. The discharge physical cleared him. "I know. He was certified fit. I know what the paperwork says." Eliza met his eyes. "The paperwork is wrong. And I don't think it's wrong by accident." The silence between them changed the shape of the room. Jace looked back at the imaging, at the bright, dense point of metal visible against the gray of soft tissue, at the uneven white line where broken bone had tried to repair itself without help. His hands came uncrossed. He set them flat on the counter on either side of the printout, and he stood like that, not moving, not speaking, while something in his face went through a reckoning he hadn't been prepared to have tonight. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. Eliza picked up her notebook. "Right now, I need you to let me treat him." She held his gaze. "After that, I need you to be ready for this to get more complicated." She gave him pain management first. Eliza worked quietly through the early morning hours, stabilizing Bishop's hip with an anti-inflammatory protocol and a nerve block that would buy him relief without masking the symptoms she still needed to monitor. He tolerated it with the stoic exhaustion of an animal that had learned over a long time that tolerance was the only available option. When she finished, he lay down on the padded mat in the observation room and closed his eyes for the first time since he'd come through the door. Jace sat on the floor next to him. Not in a chair on the floor, back against the wall, one hand resting near Bishop's shoulder without quite touching it. Eliza noted that and didn't comment on it. She went to her office, closed the door, and opened the paper notebook to the page she'd started in the imaging room. The records she had access to were limited. The discharge paperwork Jace had brought, the digital intake files from the 3 clinics Bishop had been seen at before Canyon Ridge, and the basic naval canine identification number that let her pull a thin, public-facing profile from a veterinary database she still had login credentials for. A remnant from her previous life that no one had ever bothered to revoke. What she found in those records, cross-referenced against each other and against the imaging she'd just run, assembled itself into a picture that was too consistent to be accidental. The treatment windows in Bishop's post-deployment records had been compressed visits, logged at intervals that made no clinical sense for an animal recovering from the kind of soft tissue trauma the imaging now confirmed. One set of radiographic images attached to a 6-month-old file showed a hip joint with no abnormalities anatomically different from Bishop's in 3 measurable ways. The images were from a different dog, and the certifying signature on the discharge physical, as she had already confirmed, belonged to a veterinary officer who had been retired for over a year before the document was dated. Eliza wrote all of it down longhand, without abbreviation, then closed the notebook and locked it in her desk drawer. She was still at her desk when someone knocked on her office door. The 2 people who came in were not her staff. The woman was in her late 30s, dark-haired, wearing a jacket with federal identification clipped to the lapel. The man behind her was younger, carrying a laptop bag and an expression of practiced neutrality. The woman introduced herself as Brooke Ellery and her partner as Seth Rollins, investigators with the Office of Military Animal Welfare Review. "We've been tracking Bishop's case for about 3 weeks, Brooke said, taking the chair across from Eliza's desk without being invited to. We had flags on a short list of emergency facilities within a 3-state radius, the clinics most likely to run imaging on a high-aggression former military canine whose handler was running out of options. When Bishop's intake registered here tonight, we drove." Eliza looked at them steadily. "You were monitoring Jace." "We were monitoring the situation," Seth said. "Jace's name came up when we cross-referenced handlers whose canines had passed through a specific facility. We weren't certain he'd come here. We were certain that wherever he went, it would eventually show up on a veterinary intake system." Brooke set a folder on the desk. "We know about SableTrack. We know you filed a report 4 years ago. We know what happened after." Eliza did not touch the folder. "Then you know why I'm not in a hurry to do that again." "We're not asking you to file a report," Brooke said. "We're asking you to look at what we have and tell us if it matches what you're seeing in that imaging room. Bishop is the first case where the physical evidence is still intact and the handler is willing to cooperate. If we can corroborate the medical falsification with independent clinical findings, we have something we can actually move on." Eliza opened the folder. Inside was a map of transfer records, canine unit identifiers moving through a facility listed as Fort Garrison Annex, a training installation in Wyoming, that appeared on no public directory she'd encountered. Bishop's identifier was there, alongside 5 others. All 6 had passed through Fort Garrison Annex within the same 4-month window, been certified fit for civilian placement, and subsequently developed severe behavioral issues within a year of discharge. At least 3 had been euthanized after being deemed unmanageable. At the back of the folder was a photograph. It was taken in a field setting low-light portable equipment. A dog lay on a field table, sedated, his right hip exposed and clearly traumatized. A person in surgical gloves was working on the wound. The person's face was angled down, partially obscured, but the clinic identification badge clipped to their collar was legible. The name on the badge was hers. Eliza looked at the photograph for a long time. She had done 2 field rotation assignments early in her naval program work, temporary medical support postings where cases came in fast and documentation came later, and sometimes didn't come at all. She did not remember this specific moment, but the dog on the table had the same dark fawn and black coat, the same deep chest, the same build as the animal currently lying on a mat down the hall. "When was this taken?" she asked. 4 years and 3 months ago, Seth said. Fort Garrison Annex during what was logged as a routine training exercise. Bishop was injured in the field. You with a veterinarian on rotation. Eliza set the photograph down and aligned it carefully with the edge of the folder. The information reorganized itself inside her head into a new configuration. Bishop had not simply responded to a stranger who happened to crouch at the right angle. He had responded to someone he had encountered before, in the worst circumstances of his life, when one person had done the thing that made the difference. Dogs did not remember faces the way humans did, but they carried sensory memory with a fidelity that humans rarely matched. The specific combination of scent, voice register, and touch pattern that belonged to one person and no other. The records had been altered. The connection had been erased. But Bishop had carried it forward anyway, in the only storage system no one had thought to falsify. She stood up and went to the door. Down the hall through the observation room window, she could see Jace still sitting on the floor next to Bishop. His head was leaned back against the wall, his eyes open, looking at the ceiling in the way that wasn't really looking at anything. She watched him for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate stillness of a man who had learned to perform rest without actually achieving it, and thought about how to say what she was about to say. She went in. Jace looked up. "I need to show you something," she said. "Both of you need to come to my office." He stood in her office and looked at the photograph without speaking. He looked at the transfer records. He looked at the map with Bishop's identifier connecting dots between facilities and dates. When he finally spoke, his voice had the specific flatness of someone working very hard to keep something contained. 10 months, he said. I spent 10 months thinking he was broken in his head. The people who falsified those records were counting on that conclusion, Brooke said. A dog diagnosed with psychological deterioration gets recommended for euthanasia. No further examination. No imaging. No one finds the metal fragment. Jace's eyes went back to the photograph, to the dog on the table, to the gloved hands, to the badge, and stayed there. Eliza did not try to offer him anything to soften what he was working through. The reckoning was his. The most she could do was not interrupt it. "What do you need from me?" Jace asked. His voice had come back to something level. "We need Bishop's medical history documented outside the system before anyone realizes what she's found," Seth said. Eliza was already writing when her pager went off. A direct page from the clinic director, not the overnight line. She read it, put it in her coat pocket, and said nothing to the others. The next 48 hours moved with the inevitability of things that have been set in motion and cannot be recalled. Eliza documented everything in the paper notebook and printed 2 copies of every scan, locking one set in her car. When she answered the clinic director's summons the following morning, she listened to him explain in the careful language of institutional self-preservation that the clinic's relationship with several regional military contractors made it inadvisable for her to continue cooperating with an investigation not formally sanctioned through the appropriate oversight boards. He did not tell her to stop treating Bishop. He told her to stop talking. She told him she understood and went back to work. What happened next came from a direction she had anticipated but not timed, and set his phone on the counter without saying anything. She read it, set the phone back down, and returned to the scan on the screen. "Does it change what the imaging shows?" she asked. Jace looked at her. "No." "Then it doesn't change anything." She adjusted the contrast on the image. "It's meant to make you wonder if you can trust my read on this. That's the function." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more direct. "I spent 10 months being told by credentialed people that my dog was dangerous and untreatable. Every single one of them was wrong. You were right in 90 seconds. He picked up his phone. "I know what I saw, and I know what that imaging shows." Bishop needed surgery. That fact had not changed, and was not going to change by waiting. The metal fragment was continuing to migrate in small increments, confirmed by Seth's contact at a civilian radiology center after a second review, and the nerve compression was progressing. Without surgical intervention, the deterioration would accelerate beyond repair. Eliza laid it out for Jace that evening with the clarity she used for situations where someone needed to make a real decision. She told him the risks of the surgery, the duration of the damage, the proximity of the fragment to the nerve bundle, the anesthetic load on an animal in chronic physiological stress for the better part of a year. She told him the risks of not doing it. She did not tell him what to choose. Jace listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Bishop, who was watching them both with the attentive calm of an animal that had, in the last 24 hours, stopped using all its energy to manage pain and could now direct some of it outward. "You said loving something doesn't mean protecting it from every risk," Jace said. Eliza had said it quietly, more to herself than to him, while reviewing the imaging results. She hadn't realized he'd heard it. "I meant it," she said. Jace looked at Bishop for a long time. Then he signed the surgical consent form. What moved across his face in the moment after he set down the pen was not relief and not fear, but something more complicated. The expression of a man who had made a decision he knew was right and could not protect himself from the cost of it, regardless. By signing, he also chose to stand beside Eliza, and both of them understood what that meant. That night, Brooke called with news that narrowed the remaining distance between uncomfortable and dangerous. The authorization chain for the falsified K-9 discharge certifications terminated at a single senior account holder within the Naval Special Operations Veterinary Command, Rear Admiral Warren Kest, who had overseen Sable Track, and whose connection to Prairie Line Security, a private contractor that had been receiving transferred K-9s, Seth had just confirmed through financial records. Eliza wrote the name in her notebook and closed it. She was still at her desk at midnight when the clinic's network alert flagged an anomalous access event. Someone had entered the medical records system remotely using a dormant administrative credential. By the time she reached the imaging archive, Bishop's entire file was gone. Every scan, every intake note, every result she had entered. The backup partition had been locked from outside. The Naval K-9 database now showed Bishop's discharge record with a single amendment. No orthopedic abnormalities noted. No foreign bodies detected. Record confirmed, accurate by independent review. Seth called 11 minutes later. He'd seen the same flag and was already pursuing a federal records freeze, but the window had narrowed considerably. Jace's phone, when Eliza tried to reach him, carried a restriction message, the kind that came from a federal summons, not a dead battery. Eliza sat in the empty clinic with her paper notebook in front of her and Bishop's printed scans in a folder in her bag, and a locked server full of nothing where the evidence used to be. She opened the notebook to the first page and read back through everything she'd written from the moment Bishop had walked through her door. The paper had not been touched. The paper could not be remotely accessed. It was still exactly what it had always been. Outside, the temperature had dropped below zero. The hardware store next door was dark. And somewhere inside this building, a dog that should have been dead several diagnoses ago was sleeping, without pain, for the first time in 10 months. Eliza turned to a fresh page and kept writing. The call came at 2:30 in the morning. Not from Jace, his line was still restricted. Not from Brooke, who was inside a federal building working a process that moved at the speed of institutions rather than emergencies. It came from the overnight tech, a young man named Carter who had worked at Canyon Ridge for 8 months and had the particular quality of calm that made him good at night shifts. His voice on the intercom was steady, which made what he said more alarming rather than less. "Dr. Merritt, Bishop is out of the enclosure." Eliza was already moving before he finished the sentence. She came through the door to the recovery corridor and found Carter standing 6 feet back from the hallway entrance, arms at his sides, doing exactly what she would have told him to do. Nothing. Bishop was in the middle of the corridor, not standing, not charging, not displaying any of the coiled aggression he'd come in with 2 nights ago. He was moving on his belly, rear legs dragging at an angle that told her the nerve block had worn off and the pain had returned in full, pulling himself forward on his front legs, one slow increment at a time. His breathing was audible. His eyes were fixed on the door at the end of the hall, the door to the surgical suite where Eliza had been preparing for a procedure suspended by an administrative order she had not yet decided whether to follow. 2 of the clinic's contract security staff appeared at the far end of the corridor, and one of them was unclipping something from his belt. "Don't," Eliza said without raising her voice and without looking away from Bishop. "If you discharge that near a compromised animal in a post-anesthetic state, his heart won't survive it." The security staff member stopped. He looked at Carter, who gave a small shake of his head. Eliza walked to the center of the corridor and knelt down on the floor in front of Bishop. He had stopped moving when she appeared. His front legs were still braced his head, up his breath coming in the shallow, elevated pattern of an animal running on something beyond what its body had left. She looked at him, not at his injury, not at his vitals, but at him, the specific animal who had walked through her door, who had bypassed every instruction and every trained response to put his head in her hands, who had been carrying something unbearable for so long that the carrying had been mistaken for the damage. She said quietly the words she had seen in the back of Brooks' folder, listed under Bishop's original field designation, before the records had been scrubbed. Bravo 6. Bishop went still, not the stillness of shock, the stillness of recognition. His breathing did not slow immediately, but his head dropped, and his front legs released by degrees until his chin came to rest on the cold floor. He looked up at her with eyes that were exhausted in a way that went past the physical, and she understood with a clarity that required no documentation that this animal had been waiting for someone to say that word for a very long time. She kept one hand resting on the side of his neck, feeling his pulse gradually decelerate toward something steadier. The security staff did not approach. Carter dimmed the corridor lights without being asked. She heard the outer door open and did not look up. Jace's footsteps had a particular quality, deliberate, even the walk of someone who moved through spaces by choice rather than default. He came to the entrance of the corridor and stopped. She could feel the weight of what he was seeing settle over him, without needing to see his face. "They cut my summons short," he said. His voice was steady, but carried the texture of someone who had been through something in the last several hours. Brooke intervened, filed an emergency witness protection notice that suspended the summons pending federal review. It bought me enough time to get out. He looked down the corridor at Bishop. What happened? He came out on his own. Eliza looked up at him. In the low light, the severity Jace habitually carried in his face had given way to something more exposed. He made it halfway down the corridor. Jace looked at Bishop, at the drag marks on the floor, at the distance between the enclosure door and where they were now, at what it had cost the animal to cover that distance in his condition. His throat moved. He did not say anything for a moment, and she did not fill the space. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it. I spent 3 deployments trusting him to go toward the thing that was hurting him when I pointed him there. I never thought about what it cost him to do that. Eliza looked back at Bishop. Most people don't. It's easier to trust something that doesn't ask you to think about the cost. Jace came down the corridor and crouched on the other side of Bishop, mirroring her position without appearing to mean to. He set one hand on Bishop's back, the unthinking contact of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. Bishop exhaled long, audible, the sound of something releasing that had been held for a long time. "He needs surgery tonight," Eliza said. "The fragment is moving. If we wait for the administrative process to clear, we're not going to have the same options we have right now." Jace's hand was still on Bishop's back. "You've been suspended, temporarily, pending review." She met his eyes across the dog between them. "The suspension was issued under outside pressure. It is not a clinical determination. The surgical consent you signed before the server was accessed is in my bag. The surgical suite is functional. I have what I need." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Then let's do it," he said. He reached into his jacket and set the folded consent form on the floor between them. His copy, the one printed on paper, the one that no remote access event could touch. She was scrubbed in by 3:15. Carter assisted because he was there, and because there was no one else. He set instruments where she told him to, and managed the monitoring equipment with the quiet competence of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do was stay out of her way. Jace did not come into the surgical suite. He sat in the corridor outside, back against the wall, in the same position Eliza had first found him in, beside Bishop's enclosure. She was aware of him there the way you are aware of weather, present, constant, informing the atmosphere without directing any specific part of it. The surgery lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. The fragment was smaller than the imaging had suggested, but positioned with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, wedged against the sciatic nerve bundle in a location that maximized pain transmission while minimizing external visibility. She worked slowly and without music, the way she always worked when the margin for error was this narrow. She repaired the ligament damage, addressed the malunion of the iliac fracture with what the clinic's surgical inventory could offer, enclosed in layers, taking more time than was strictly necessary, because she was not going to do this twice. When she came out at 6:07, the corridor was pale with early light, coming through the window at the far end. Jace looked up when the door opened. "He's stable," she said. 6 to 8 weeks of restricted activity and a full rehabilitation protocol. He'll walk without pain. If the nerve responds the way the post-op confirmed that its material composition matched the specifications of equipment documented in a mission report that officially listed Bishop as not present for that engagement. The falsification had always needed a physical contradiction to collapse, and now it had one that could not be digitally altered or remotely deleted. The chain unraveled with the acceleration of things held together by pressure rather than structure. Rear Admiral Warren Kest was summoned before the Oversight Committee. Several officers in the authorization chain, once the physical evidence made the digital erasure irrelevant, began cooperating in the ways that people cooperate when the alternative has become significantly worse than disclosure. Prairie Line Security's accounts were frozen pending audit. The K-9 identifiers from the Fort Garrison Annex records became the foundation of a systematic, independent review of every animal that had passed through that facility. Eliza's original report from 4 years ago was pulled from the administrative archive, where it had been categorized as inconclusive. The review took 11 days. The result was a written determination that her findings had been accurate, that the process used to dismiss them had been procedurally improper, and that the characterizations placed in her personnel file did not reflect clinical reality. The clinic director retracted the suspension without being asked twice. She read the determination letter once at her desk, then folded it and put it in the fireproof box in her closet, alongside everything she'd kept from 4 years ago. Not because it didn't matter. Because what mattered was not the letter, but what came after it. The independent veterinary assessments that began for the remaining animals in the program. The cases that had been closed and were now being reopened. The slow institutional work of finding out which dogs were still alive and what they actually needed. That was the work. The letter was just the permission to do it. 6 weeks later, on a morning when the snow had thinned to a pale dusting across the field behind Canyon Ridge, Eliza unlatched Bishop's recovery enclosure and walked him outside for the first time since his surgery. He took the threshold slowly, testing his right rear leg with the deliberate attention of an animal that had learned not to trust a surface until it had been verified. Then he moved through the door and onto the frozen ground, and the deliberateness gave way to something else. Not speed, not the focused drive of a working dog moving toward a target, but the unhurried quality of an animal that had somewhere to be and was not in pain getting there. Jace was standing at the edge of the field. He had stayed in Redstone Bend through the recovery, sleeping in the same room as Bishop in the clinic's family boarding suite, which Carter had quietly made available without raising it with the director. He watched Bishop cross the field toward him, taking in the movement of the right rear leg, the natural swing of the hip, the absence of the compensatory shoulder hitch that had been present in every step for the past 10 months. Bishop reached him, pushed his head briefly against Jace's hand, then turned and looked back toward Eliza. He stood between them for a moment, not choosing, not divided, simply occupying the space between two people who were both, in their different ways, part of the reason he was standing on this ground without pain. Then he turned and moved out into the open field, his stride lengthening as the frozen ground gave him back what had been taken from him. Jace watched him go, in a long time, simply somewhere, rather than surviving it. "I'm going to be part of the oversight panel," Eliza said. "They asked, and I said yes. Independent assessment rights for every animal in the program. Results made public. No more closed certification chains." Jace looked at her then. "I know what it cost the first time," she said before he could speak. "I'm doing it anyway." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back out at Bishop, who had started moving again, across the pale field, unhurried, purposeful, carrying nothing that did not belong to him. "Yeah," Jace said quietly. "I know." The morning light moved across the snow in long, flat lines, and the field was quiet. And Bishop ran. Bishop was labeled dangerous for 10 months. The real danger was that no one looked closely enough to ask why. If this story stayed with you, the idea that aggression is sometimes just pain with nowhere else to go, that the people who get pushed out of systems are sometimes the ones who saw the truth first, that loyalty doesn't always look like obedience, then you already know why these stories matter. Subscribe if you want more of them. And if someone in your life is being written off too quickly as difficult, as broken, as too much to handle, maybe look a little closer first. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to walk away.